Before the sun crests the horizon, the air is thick with mist and the sound of thousands of men breathing. There is the scent of wet girth, the soft clinking of cold metal, and a heavy, suffocating tension. For millennia, humanity lived as nomadic foragers, leaving little behind to fight over. But the moment communities settled into fertile river valleys to plant seeds and harvest crops, they created a surplus. They amassed stationary wealth, grain stores and livestock that someone else could take by force. To guard those grain silos from raiders, early societies learned to stack mud brick and stone. Towering, fortified walls rose over the plains of the Near East, turning vulnerable settlements into the world's first true cities. Defensive walls required better offensive weapons. We learned to smelt copper and tin together, producing bronze. This material could be poured into molds, allowing kingdoms to cast identical, highly durable spearheads and axe blades by the thousands. Armed with standardized weapons, the chaotic, free-for-all skirmishes of tribal raiders vanished. On the dusty plains of ancient Sumer, men were drilled to stand shoulder to shoulder, marching in tight, synchronized blocks. The professional soldier had arrived. Survival no longer rested on the heroic strength of an individual warrior. To forge and protect the first empires, communities had to commit acts of violence in absolute, terrifying mass unison. By the time the fires of the forge unlocked iron, the lethality of combat rapidly accelerated. Iron was cheaper and far more plentiful than bronze, allowing ambitious kings to arm hundreds of thousands of men for massive, close-quarters slaughter. The Greeks perfected this heavy infantry doctrine with the hoplite. Each man carried a massive, bowl-shaped wooden shield called an aspis. But the mechanics of this shield were communal. It only covered half of the bearer's body, explicitly designed to extend over the exposed right side of the man standing to his left. When two rival phalanxes collided, combat devolved into a horrifying physics problem. Ranks of men in the rear drove their shields into the backs of their own comrades, creating a suffocating shove that literally crushed the front lines to death under hundreds of tons of human pressure. Enduring that crush required supreme psychological conditioning. The Spartans named this martial excellence and unbreakable duty arete. It was the absolute psychological anchor that kept 300 Spartans locked in a doomed, unflinching wall against a sea of Persian invaders at Thermopylae. For centuries, the fate of the entire Mediterranean world rested squarely on the brute physical willpower of these tightly packed human walls. But as empires pushed their borders out of narrow valleys and into sweeping deserts and steppes, the static wall of infantry broke. Vast open distances introduced the terrifying speed of Scythian horse archers and the heavy, thundering charge of armored Persian cataphracts. We see the strategic answer to this vastness etched in the marble features of Alexander the Great. He recognized that the iron wall of the phalanx reached its full potential only when paired with high-speed mobility. He equipped his Macedonian foot soldiers with the sarissa, an 18-foot pike. This immense wooden spear allowed Alexander to trap and kin the enemy front line in place, creating a fixed target for his more agile units. This top-down diagram illustrates the exact mechanics of his hammer and anvil strike at Gaugamela. The rigid line of pike-wielding infantry acts as an immovable anvil, locking the Persian forces in place. Simultaneously, Alexander's elite companion cavalry acts as the hammer, sweeping far around the flank to shatter the exposed rear. Watching these visual lines shift shows how Hannibal advanced this tactical logic generations later against Rome at Cannae. He intentionally bowed his infantry outward, letting his center yield and bleed backward. As the furious Romans poured into the collapsing center, Hannibal's cavalry wings swung violently shut around both flanks, executing a flawless double envelopment. Success required a mental bridge between separate forces. The battlefield had become a high-stakes chessboard, dictated by deception, mobility, and the calculating mind of the commander. Rome lost tens of thousands of men to Hannibal's traps, but the Republic absorbed the slaughter and adapted. They shattered the rigid, single-block phalanx into the manipular system, a cellular, hyper-flexible formation that could easily flow over broken terrain without losing cohesion. They organized these manipulars into 3 staggered, checkerboard lines known as the triplex achies.
When the front ranks grew physically exhausted from the hacking and screaming of melee, they seamlessly filtered back through the gaps, allowing completely fresh, heavily armed reserves to step directly into the killing zone. The instrument of that killing zone was the gladius. Notice the stout hilt and the violently tapered point. This blade was engineered for one grim purpose: short, mechanically efficient upward thrusts in tightly packed formations, where swinging a longer sword was utterly impossible. Beyond the bloody efficiency of their infantry, the Roman military doubled as an industrial engineering force, capable of terraforming the battlefield overnight. Julius Caesar pushed this engineering terror to its absolute limit at Alesia. To break the Gauls, his legions laid down their swords, picked up shovels, and constructed two massive, continuous rings of wooden walls and spiked trenches, one facing inward to starve the defenders, and a second facing outward to repel a massive relief army. This industrial scale extended to the water. At Salamis and Actium, crews rode their vessels as human-powered ballistics, straining together to achieve the tremendous ramming speed required to drive a heavy, bronze-sheathed prow completely through the wooden hull of an enemy ship. War had completely outgrown local disputes over grain and cattle. It had evolved into an unstoppable, continent-spanning machine built for total, systematic conquest. Strip away the grand strategies, the marble monuments, and the sweeping maps, and what remains is the solitary soldier, a man trapped in a deafening, chaotic crush of screaming metal, slipping in mud and blood, fighting simply to survive the next breath. The psychological pressure to stand firm in that nightmare was immense. Ancient societies enforced merciless honor codes, like the Roman concept of virtus. Retreat was a cultural disgrace far worse than death, forcing men to hold the line until their bodies physically gave out. The collective, agonizing willpower of those armies physically scarred the earth. You can see it carved into the stone spine of the Great Wall, tracing the mountainous horizon of China. The sheer exertion of these ancient forces drew the permanent boundaries of the known world. Eventually, the grand formations fractured. As the central authority of the classical empires slowly rotted and fell into ruin during late antiquity, warfare regressed, splintering back into the localized clashes of migrating warbands. Their bronze has long since rusted, and their mighty siege walls have crumbled to dust. Yet the tactical brilliance, the brutal engineering, and the ultimate, terrifying sacrifices of those ancient armies forged the bloody, enduring foundations of human civilization. Before machines dictated the pace of battle, conflict relied on the physical stamina of men and horses. Commanders deployed cavalry charges across open fields, and victories were won through localized skirmishes and raw human courage. Then, coal and iron compressed distance. The steam locomotive bypassed the natural exhaustion limits of marching boots and horse-drawn wagons. Laying thousands of miles of track required precise coordination. Pulses of electricity through copper wire allowed generals to synchronize troop movements across entire continents in seconds. Governments harnessed this dual network of rail and telegraph to execute a mathematical feat. They extracted millions of men from civilian life, loaded them into train cars, and deposited them at the front lines overnight. The individual warrior dissolved into a massive, uniform collective. Armies ballooned into millions of identical men, each holding a factory-stamped helmet and a mass-produced rifle. Success was no longer a question of who had the most daring soldiers, but who could maintain the largest system. Victory was becoming a contest of throughput, the ability to keep a continent-sized machine fed with a constant stream of men and material. In the mud of the First World War, infantry offensives halted without heavy munitions. To survive, these soldiers relied entirely on an unbroken chain of heavy brass shells, fed continuously into smoking artillery breaches. To advance across no man's land, troops required a rolling barrage. This tactic demanded long rows of heavy cannons firing in total unison to create a creeping wall of explosions that shielded the infantry. Sustaining that protective curtain required millions of rounds. A single days-long offensive consumed massive, unending stacks of artillery shells. draining entire national stockpiles in a matter of weeks. Commanders stopped trying to outmaneuver each other. The battlefield devolved into a gruesome mathematical equation. Whoever could continuously replace their shattered steel and exhausted men would eventually watch the enemy run dry. By the Second World War, the front line extended directly into civilian life. Nations retooled their domestic economies, mobilizing millions of women into factories where every minute on the clock translated directly to military survival. Civilian manufacturing infrastructure violently pivoted. Assembly line efficiency, originally designed for automobiles, was adapted to churn out complex aircraft and weaponry at a staggering scale. Supplying these massive factory floors forced grand strategy to adapt. Military leaders stood in boardrooms, mapping out global supply chains, calculating how to secure rubber, steel, and oil from continents away. Planners realized tanks were only as dangerous as their assembly lines. Targeting enemy factories and fuel networks could effectively paralyze an army before it ever fired a shot. When the supply chains held, the result on the battlefield was absolute. Armored columns advanced as an unstoppable flood of metal, pouring directly from the assembly lines to overwhelm the opposition. The victor was simply the nation capable of scaling production, absorbing massive losses, and rapidly building replacements. Industrial capacity was the ultimate weapon. The chaotic, fiery foundries of the mid-20th century have evolved into systems of cold, automated precision. Today's global shipping networks move tonnage with a scale and geometry that dwarfs historical logistics. Modern conflict demands that this complex hardware be projected across the globe almost instantly. Heavy-lift military transport planes deliver immense payloads to foreign tarmacs in hours, not weeks. Yet every operation remains tethered to physical reality. Frontline forces will collapse without the continuous, grinding maintenance of physical resupply convoys pushing through hostile terrain. This chart compares precision munition consumption against replacement capacity. A plunging line tracks the burn-through of a year's inventory in weeks. The shallow bottom line shows a factory response taking years to catch up. This mathematical mismatch creates a difficult reality for modern military planners. If a conflict outlasts the initial stockpiles, highly advanced armies are forced back into the slow, grueling rhythm of industrial attrition. A nation's true military might stretches exactly as far as its industrial base allows. As long as the factories breathe, the war continues. In the 1960s, armies designed for mass attrition stepped into a vacuum. In these jungles, the logic of the industrial-era frontline vanished. Power meant nothing when the enemy could strike from the suffocating foliage and disappear before a single coordinate could be called in. Survival required a total departure from traditional doctrine. Specialized units began adopting the enemy's irregular tactics, utilizing tiger stripe camouflage and localized gear to fight a war defined by proximity rather than distance. These conflicts proved that mass without visibility is just a larger target. Survival on the modern battlefield shifted from moving divisions to moving small, specialized teams capable of identifying and striking a specific room from miles away. By the 1990s, that jungle blindness was replaced by the clarity of a thermal screen. Combat moved from the mud into a digitized space, where targets could be tracked and destroyed from beyond the horizon. This dented missile casing represents a shift in how wars are won. A single surgical strike could now dismantle a command hub, achieving in seconds what once required weeks of carpet bombing. Technology like the F-117 Nighthawk allowed for striking with impunity. By making air defenses irrelevant, it ensured that the opening move of every modern conflict would happen before the enemy even knew the war had started. Sensors and munitions were now linked in real time. This cruise missile, capable of autonomous flight over hundreds of miles, turned the entire theater into an inescapable web of lethality. The requirements for victory changed. A force that can see the whole board and strike specific targets remotely can dismantle a national defense system in hours, bypassing the need for the million-man armies of the past. In this operations center, global distance is reduced to pixels. Analysts at these desks manage a constant flow of telemetry and drone feeds, turning raw data into actionable strikes across 3 different continents simultaneously at a single workstation. Commanders now operate with a bird's eye view, monitoring every movement within a province in real time. They filter through petabytes of data to identify fleeting targets that only appear for seconds at a time. Success depends on the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. In modern warfare, the winner is whoever can process this information and execute a decision faster than the enemy can react. That intelligence feeds directly into panoramic goggles like these, allowing a raid team to see around corners and through walls in near total darkness. In this space, the speed of your equipment determines the speed of your survival. The network acts as a force multiplier. When sensors can talk to shooters in seconds, a 4-man team can exert the pressure of a full company. Control the data stream, and you control the pace of the engagement. But billion-dollar networks have limits. In a mud brick village, the digital edge blurs. Operators are forced back into a world of human intuition, navigating complex cultural landscapes where the high-tech sensors often see only walls. Even with precise intelligence, urban combat remains a game of inches and shattered concrete. Clearing a single city block can take days of grueling room-to-room fighting that no algorithm can simplify. Resilient adversaries adapt by hiding in plain sight. They weaponize civilian life, turning ordinary city streets into minefields of IEDs and decentralized threats that the network was never designed to track. Maintaining this digital dominance requires a massive logistical tail. Every drone feed and satellite link is supported by a constant, physical flow of fuel, batteries, and hardware moving through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Technological superiority is not a guarantee of a quick end. Human friction and enemy adaptation ensure that modern wars are persistent, often dragging on long after the initial tactical objectives have been met. We have entered the gray zone, a state of constant competition where state actors use proxies and cyber incursions to fight just below the threshold of an open declaration of war. The era of one-sided dominance is fading. Near-peer adversaries have spent decades analyzing these network-centric strategies and have now deployed their own precision strike and intelligence webs. When both sides are networked, the first objective is to blind the opponent. If the digital HUD glitches out or the radio is jammed, the modern operator is suddenly forced to fight in a technological blackout. The proliferation of cheap, ubiquitous sensors has turned the globe into a watched fishbowl. There is no longer such a thing as a secret movement. Every vehicle and every soldier is being tracked by someone, somewhere. In this environment, communication becomes a liability. If both sides possess the high ground, the battle space reverts to a terrifying, invisible stalemate, where the first person to emit a signal is the first person to be targeted. Modern sensors automatically hunt human heat signatures, passing targets to autonomous systems that don't need a human trigger. Decision cycles have compressed so much that human reaction time is a bottleneck. Machines execute strikes at speeds commanders cannot match. This creates a unique kind of isolation. When the radio turns to static and the HUD glitches out, you are alone in the cold against an enemy that doesn't need to breathe, an algorithmic swarm calculating your coordinates in real time. Algorithms and networks will continue to accelerate the pace of warfare, but in the end, human endurance and rapid on-the-ground adaptation remain the fragile linchpins of survival in the shadows of decision.
Look out across the open ocean, and you see a featureless void. There are no hills to hide behind, no trenches to dig, no forests for cover. Surviving out here means dominating the surface. Because the sea is so vast, ancient naval combat was ironically intimate. To defeat an enemy, you had to get uncomfortably close. You had to cross the open water and fight at zero distance. At the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, Greek commanders relied on sheer physical momentum. They propelled their heavy, bronze-clad galleys across the water to ram and shatter the timber hulls of the opposing fleet. But treating your entire ship as a weapon is a precarious strategy. A high-speed collision guarantees massive structural damage to both vessels, risking the survival of the very fleet you need to project power. To effectively control the seas, navies had to solve a basic geometric problem. They needed to expand the kill zone, finding a way to destroy the enemy without physically crashing into them. By the age of sail, commanders had their solution. Wind-powered warships evolved into massive floating artillery fortresses, carrying dozens of heavy cannons stacked across multiple decks. This required a rigid new tactical geometry. At Trafalgar, fleets arranged themselves into precise linear formations, the line of battle. Sailing nose to tail maximized the firing angles for their heavy guns. When these lines engaged, commanders unleashed the broadside. Synchronized line-of-sight cannon blasts from dozens of guns at once would systematically obliterate the timber and structural integrity of an enemy hull. These heavily armed fleets also allowed nations to choke off trade. By parking a wall of cannons outside a harbor, navies could enforce a blockade, strangling an enemy economy without firing a single kinetic shot. The lethality of the warship now extended from point-blank range out to the visible horizon. Yet, to sink an enemy, a captain still needed direct visual contact. That geometric limitation broke entirely with the introduction of naval aviation. Aircraft carriers stretched the battle space hundreds of miles past the curvature of the Earth. During the Battle of Midway, carrier strike groups fought an entire engagement without the surface fleets ever seeing each other. Dive bombers and torpedo planes navigated heavy anti-aircraft flak to strike vessels entirely over the horizon. Simultaneously, commanders pushed the battle space downward. Submarines turned the flat surface board of the ocean into a three-dimensional hunting ground. Operating in stealth, submarine wolf packs hunted merchant convoys. Relying on unguided torpedo runs, they systematically severed the global supply lines that kept war efforts alive. By mastering both the sky and the deep, fleets removed the strict requirement of line of sight. The ocean had become an invisible, over-the-horizon grid of destruction. The cold calculus of modern sea combat arrived during the Falklands War. Anti-ship missiles proved that a single, precise strike could compromise the structural integrity of an entire modern warship. Today, combat reaction times are compressed into seconds. A supersonic weapon skimming just feet above the waves, triggered by a distant radar blip, leaves a crew with almost no time to respond. This 3D diagram shows how modern fleets survive. They project an area denial threat bubble around themselves, mapping incoming low-altitude vectors and launching overlapping layers of electronic countermeasures and automated interceptors. Navies use this localized sea dominance to project power straight onto land. Amphibious assault elements push onto the beach under the protective umbrella of over-the-horizon fire support. Yet the apex predator of this environment operates entirely detached from the surface chaos. The nuclear submarine glides continuously through the deep, acting as a silent, global strategic deterrent. The warship has evolved from a wooden battering ram to a stealth missile node, but the absolute truth of the Leviathan remains what it was in the ancient world. Global supremacy requires total mastery over the featureless, unforgiving sea.
For millennia, the horizon ended where Earth met sea. The sky remained an untouched, silent void, a space where human violence could not reach. That silence broke during the First World War. In the early days, pilots took to the air to scout enemy movements, often waving to their counterparts in the opposing trenches as they passed through the clouds. These machines were fragile, wood frames and stretched canvas held together by wire. They were eyes in the sky, transmitting the exact locations of ground troops to heavy artillery batteries. When it became clear that a single pilot could direct a lethal artillery barrage on 1,000 men, the waving stopped. Handguns were drawn, then came rifles, and finally, heavy machine guns synchronized to fire through the blur of a spinning propeller. By the end of the conflict, the air was no longer a sanctuary. It was the primary vantage point. If a commander lost control of the sky, his soldiers in the mud were blind, exposed, and defenseless. World War II replaced the individual duels of WW1 with the sheer industrial volume of mass destruction. Formations of B-24 Liberators could carry thousands of pounds of explosives across oceans, targeting the infrastructure that fueled the enemy's war machine. Defending against these swarms required interceptors, specialized fighters designed to climb thousands of feet in minutes and shred bombers before they reached their targets. The P-38 Lightning was engineered for this high-altitude hunt, featuring twin engines for speed and a heavy concentration of nose-mounted cannons. As planes flew faster and in larger numbers, the human eye became the weak link. Ground spotters could no longer detect an incoming swarm early enough to launch their defenders. This oscilloscope shows the radio echoes of objects hundreds of miles away. It allowed a single technician to see through thick cloud cover and total darkness. Aerial combat transitioned into a mathematical exercise. The sky became a digital grid, where survival depended on interpreting data before the enemy appeared in person. The jet engine pushed aircraft towards the speed of sound, creating friction and forces that traditional airframes could not withstand. These F-84 Thunderjets show the radical shift in aerodynamics. Sleeker bodies and swept wings, designed to survive the intense pressures of supersonic flight. At these speeds, human reflexes failed. Pilots often crossed paths too quickly to track a target or aim a fixed gun with any accuracy. Guided missiles removed the need for manual aim, adjusting their own flight paths to pursue targets through high-speed maneuvers. Engagement ranges expanded to 50 miles, beyond visual range combat, where the first indication of an enemy is just a warning light. Modern pilots rely on algorithmic certainty. They secure sensor locks from miles away and fire, ending fights before ever seeing the other aircraft. Ground defenses eventually evolved into automated grids of radar and missiles, turning the sky into a lethal, networked wall of fire. These missile batteries can track dozens of targets simultaneously, launching supersonic projectiles that are almost impossible for a standard aircraft to outrun. If an aircraft cannot outfly these sensors, it must bypass them. Modern doctrine shifted from flying faster to becoming invisible. The F-117 Nighthawk uses these jagged, flat panels to deflect radar waves away from the receiver. It is designed to appear as small as a bird on a defensive screen. The B-2 Spirit extends this capability to global ranges. Its curved, wing-like shape allows it to fly deep into guarded territory to deliver its payload without appearing on any radar network. The pilots who once waved to each other have been replaced by the architects of these unseen predators. The sky remains the ultimate domain of conflict, an environment where the side that owns the heavens dictates the fate of the earth below. The uncrewed aircraft began as a tool for reconnaissance, gathering intelligence over the next hill without losing a man to enemy fire. By the Vietnam War, these platforms evolved into high-altitude reconnaissance craft, designed to glide over jungle canopies and photograph supply routes undetected. However, the technology was strictly passive. These drones were essentially flying film canisters that had to return to base before their data could be extracted and analyzed. Early uncrewed systems successfully removed the pilot from physical danger, but they lacked the real-time capability to alter the battlefield. They provided a delayed echo of the war. The operational rhythm transitioned during conflicts in the Balkans. Drones were integrated into active, continuous operations, providing a persistent eye over dense urban environments. The MQ-1 Predator closed the critical time gap. It combined real-time video with internal weapon pylons, allowing for immediate execution of targets identified on screen. This timeline visualizes the doctrine of persistent ISR. An uncrewed system can loiter over a single coordinate for 24 continuous hours, operating entirely outside the physical fatigue limits of a human pilot. The MQ-9 Reaper advanced this capability as a purpose-built heavy strike platform, designed from the airframe up to carry advanced precision munitions over vast distances. Integrating limitless endurance with instant lethal precision turned the drone into the primary weapon for asymmetric warfare. Modern operations move directly into dense populated environments, requiring absolute precision to execute targeted strikes among civilian infrastructure. And so this environment birthed the reconnaissance strike complex. The entire cycle of observing a location, acquiring a specific target, and executing the strike compressed into a single, near-simultaneous motion. This map tracks the bottleneck, signal latency. Inputs travel from the theater to a satellite down to a command center thousands of miles away, creating an unavoidable delay. Because crosshairs lag behind reality, rigid rules prevent accidental strikes if non-combatants suddenly enter the target zone. The operator sits completely insulated from physical danger, yet watches the high-definition impact of their trigger pull in real time. The reconnaissance strike complex provides a total view of the battlefield, but restricts the kill chain to the processing speed and connectivity limits of a human being. As high-end platforms grew more expensive and scarce, a counter-doctrine emerged, the attritable asset. Militaries began deploying low-cost, expendable drone masses designed specifically to overwhelm defenses and hunt high-value targets. Commercial quadcopters allow non-state doctors and smaller militias to negate the advantages of superpower militaries, effectively building an air force for a few $100s. Strapping explosives to these frames created first-person view kamikaze drones, turning a basic hobbyist tool into a highly maneuverable precision loitering munition. This dynamic completely inverted the financial logic of air defense. Conventional militaries now fire million-dollar interceptor missiles to destroy hardware built from cheap plastic and wire. The rapid proliferation of cheap drones democratized the airspace, making mass and expendability as lethal as technological sophistication. To counter established defenses, modern tactical doctrine integrated these systems into drone-led seed operations, the suppression of enemy air defenses. This map illustrates the vanguard wave. A swarm of attritable drones flies into hostile airspace as a sacrifice, forcing the enemy radar to emit signals, plotting its coordinates. Immediately, secondary loitering munitions follow, riding the signal down to destroy the exposed air defenses. Beyond kinetic strikes, drones act as forward nodes for electronic warfare. They penetrate enemy lines to actively jam communications and blind radar systems at the tactical edge. Drones evolved from isolated strike platforms into an integrated web designed to dismantle enemy infrastructure from the inside out. In contemporary conflicts, the scale of mass drone usage ensures the battlefield sky is entirely saturated with uncrewed systems. Operating in this density means fighting in a heavily contested electromagnetic environment. The invisible links between human operators and their machines are constantly jammed or severed by electronic warfare. The sheer volume of incoming threats and the unreliability of control signals have pushed human-in-the-loop control to its functional limit. To maintain lethality when signals drop, the targeting cycle is being handed over to AI-enhanced decision-making systems on board the aircraft itself. This network graph models autonomous swarms. These drones communicate peer-to-peer, navigating and executing complex strikes entirely independent of a centralized command center. When paired with emerging hypersonic airframes, these autonomous systems execute operations at speeds that exceed the reaction time of any human defense system. Algorithms are now writing the final step of the kill chain, evaluating variables and executing lethal maneuvers independent of human oversight. Humanity spent a century building machines to safely distance the pilot from the battlefield, only to create a domain where the machine makes the final decision.
For most of human history, the space around us appeared entirely empty, but a massive, silent dimension of electromagnetic waves has always blanketed the Earth, passing completely unnoticed through the physical world. During the Second World War, the invention of radar allowed operators to detect objects and map the environment through that invisible domain for the very first time. Human operators stationed in coastal bunkers and command centers learned to decode these raw emitted signals. They tracked returning echoes to pinpoint enemy aircraft long before those planes reached the physical horizon. But emitting a signal to see in the dark creates an immediate vulnerability. A beam of energy radiating outward gives away the observer's exact location, and the returning echo can be manipulated to deceive the receiver. Aircrews quickly learned to drop thousands of strips of aluminum foil, commonly known as chaff, into the sky.
The metal reflected the radar waves, flooding enemy screens with false returns and masking the true flight paths of the bombers. As the Cold War escalated, militaries built increasingly complex arrays of transmitters and receivers. They engaged in a continuous cycle of generating signals and deploying countermeasures to disrupt them, establishing the formal discipline of electronic warfare. Physical supremacy in the air or on the ground was no longer sufficient. Securing a kinetic victory required total control over this unseen layer of light and data. By the time of the Vietnam War, intercepting enemy signals evolved from a passive method of gathering intelligence into an active, lethal hunting strategy. Crews flying specialized wild weasel missions deliberately entered hostile airspace, baiting surface-to-air missile batteries to turn on their targeting radars. Once the enemy transmitted, the pilots locked on to those specific emissions and destroyed the sites. To do this, they relied on anti-radiation missiles. Instead of tracking a physical heat signature, the missile's seeker head locks on to the invisible energy of a hostile radar beam, routing that specific frequency directly back to its source. These localized suppression tactics scaled significantly over the next 2 decades. Operations in the 1982 Baca Valley and the 1991 Gulf War proved that neutralizing an enemy's communication and detection networks resulted in total battlefield dominance. Maintaining that level of control required deploying large airborne early warning platforms. These aircraft orbited high above the physical fight, acting as mobile command centers to manage the entire spectrum from the sky. Military planners codified these operations into a rigid doctrine, dividing the control of the electromagnetic environment into 3 distinct pillars of combat. The capability to move or communicate freely now relies entirely on these pillars. A modern conflict is decided before the first physical shot is fired, dictated entirely by whichever force successfully blinds its opponent first. The first pillar is electronic support. Networked operators continuously listen, capture, and map all emitted frequencies, creating a real-time picture of the invisible threat landscape around them. Once a threat is mapped, forces execute the second pillar, electronic attack. This involves projecting targeted bursts of electromagnetic energy outward to degrade or neutralize enemy hardware. This diagram outlines the 3 primary methods of jamming a signal. Operators use barrage jamming to flood a wide band of frequencies with noise, spot jamming to target one highly specific channel, or sweep jamming to continuously shift interference across multiple bands. By blasting raw energy directly into these frequencies, the interference overwhelms the target's receivers. The authentic signal is drowned out by static, hiding incoming aircraft or creating false echoes on the enemy screen. The third pillar, electronic protection, is designed to survive these attacks. As this animation shows, a data stream rapidly jumps across a grid of available frequencies, shifting its position multiple times a second to avoid massive blocks of interference. By breaking communications into these rapid, randomized hops, the transmission blends into the natural background radiation. The enemy cannot easily lock onto the signal, allowing forces to coordinate without triggering detection systems. On the modern front line, the boundary between cyber operations and traditional electronic warfare has dissolved. Personnel continuously adjust localized hardware in real time to re-establish links when subjected to GPS denial and targeted communication blackouts. These 3 pillars operate in a continuous high-speed loop of measure and countermeasure. Relying on a single, static frequency guarantees immediate detection and destruction. Modern military doctrine treats the spectrum as the primary theater of engagement. Hardware is now designed and deployed specifically to contest this space, prioritizing the capture and control of local frequencies over simple physical movement. Severing these connections causes an immediate collapse of situational awareness. Encrypted navigation signals fail, communication links disconnect, and radar screens clear of data, leaving a force isolated and unable to coordinate a response. The arms race is now moving beyond the atmosphere. Satellites contest orbital frequencies, and opposing networks battle to dominate the data flow of high-capacity 5G and 6G spectrums. Emerging quantum sensors provide a new path for detection by measuring minute fluctuations in the subatomic environment. They track the localized disturbances created by objects moving through space, providing a way to monitor hypersonic targets that current radar systems struggle to resolve. Surviving in this hyper-fast environment requires a reaction time far exceeding human capability, leading to the deployment of cognitive electronic warfare. This system uses machine learning to map unfamiliar signals. When it encounters a novel radar frequency, it instantly analyzes the pattern and generates a precise counterwave. The software executes these countermeasures autonomously, removing humans from the decision cycle, adapting in fractions of a second. The future of the spectrum resides in total autonomy. Algorithmic battles now occur in the milliseconds before physical contact, with systems executing tactical dominance in total silence at the speed of light. The most destructive weapon of the modern era was carried into its target on a standard USB drive. For decades, state-sponsored hacking was confined to intelligence gathering. Operatives broke into networks to copy classified data, remaining invisible and leaving the physical world untouched. That boundary dissolved with the emergence of code engineered to manipulate physical hardware. This software was designed to force industrial machines to tear themselves apart from the inside. This crossover meant that silicon-based systems were now as vulnerable to attrition as physical supply lines or fuel depots. Operation Olympic Games targeted Natanz, a fortified Iranian nuclear facility buried under concrete and disconnected from the internet. To bypass these defenses, the Stuxnet worm was smuggled inside, bridging the air gap. Once inside, it silently replicated from terminal to terminal. For the engineers in the control room, everything looked completely fine. Stuxnet intercepted the monitoring software, feeding the human operators looped, normal telemetry data. But down on the facility floor, the reality was violently different. The malicious code commanded the massive steel uranium centrifuges to accelerate wildly, pushing them far beyond their design limits until the metal warped and snapped. Nearly 1,000 calibrated industrial cylinders were wrecked. Operators were left staring at the debris of their own hardware, dismantled by an invisible force. A fortified target was destroyed without a single soldier crossing a border or firing a shot. The concept was proven, and state actors around the world immediately took notice. The methods deployed at Natanz could not be contained to a single operation. Once intelligence agencies demonstrated that code could cause kinetic damage, rival state actors began engineering their own hostile software. This led to the deployment of NotPetya and WannaCry. Unlike the highly precise strike on a specific nuclear facility, these were military-grade cyberweapons released recklessly into the open internet. They were built as self-replicating digital contagions. Once introduced to a network, the software hunted for vulnerabilities and spread instantly from system to system, requiring no human interaction to execute its payload. The code behaved like a biological virus escaping a laboratory, propagating through the global network at speeds that overwhelmed standard security protocols. Global supply chains collapsed almost immediately. The internal networks of international shipping conglomerates like Maersk were infected, leaving thousands of immense cargo cranes frozen dead against the sky. Ships were unable to dock or unload. Trucking depots backed up. A digital lock applied to corporate servers entirely halted the physical movement of the world's goods across multiple continents. The collateral damage quickly reached civilian safety. Entire hospital networks were caught in the crossfire as their systems locked down simultaneously, rendering patient records and scheduling systems completely inaccessible. The disruption extended straight into operating rooms. Life-saving medical monitors went dark without warning, forcing surgical teams to halt procedures mid-incision. These strikes against the logistical veins of civilian life caused financial and logistical disruptions that exceeded the damage of many physical bombing campaigns. The chaos caused by NotPetya taught advanced state hacking groups like Fancy Bear and Volt Typhoon a critical lesson. Mass, uncontrolled disruption triggers international backlash and risks severe retaliation. They shifted their doctrine to a strategy called pre-positioning. Instead of launching immediate, noisy attacks, these units quietly embed their code deep inside adversary networks and sit entirely dormant. The SolarWinds breach demonstrated how an attacker can leverage a single, trusted point of failure to compromise thousands of high-value targets at once. Hackers managed to poison a routine, trusted software update sent out to SolarWinds clients. When network administrators installed the patch, they unknowingly pulled malicious code right through their own firewalls, granting attackers access to thousands of classified government and corporate databases. Hostile state actors have transitioned into a state of permanent, invisible occupation inside our critical systems. This silent infiltration has already trickled down to the municipal level. Sleeper code has been identified sitting inactive inside the software that manages our domestic water filtration plants and local utilities. It is actively embedded within the digital systems that govern electrical transmission towers, quietly logging the flow of power to millions of homes and businesses. These digital weapons are not destroying anything right now. They are simply waiting in the dark, positioned and ready for a single geopolitical command to detonate. When that keystroke happens, the result will be a cascading, unpreventable blackout, plunging entire regions into total darkness. The ordinance of the next global conflict is already in place. Every connected device now sits on the modern front line. Above the protection of our atmosphere lies a geographic blind spot. In this vacuum, hundreds of miles overhead, the sensors and communication nodes that modern nations rely on drift in exposed, predictable paths. Modern military operations depend on this orbital layer for encrypted communication and millisecond-accurate timing. If these assets are removed, a ground force loses its ability to synchronize maneuvers or strike targets beyond the physical horizon, effectively blinding the command structure before a terrestrial battle even begins. This reliance has led to the development of direct ascent anti-satellite interceptors, ground-launched missiles designed for a single purpose: high-altitude intersection. This map plots the physics required for a successful strike. To hit a target moving at 17,000 miles per hour, the interceptor must follow a precise ballistic arc that places it directly in the satellite's path at the exact moment of crossing. After clearing the atmosphere, the multi-stage booster falls away. The remaining kill vehicle uses its own onboard thrusters and thermal sensors to lock on to the heat signature of the target against the cold background of space. The destruction is achieved through pure collision. At these velocities, the impact of the kill vehicle's mass is enough to instantly shatter the satellite into thousands of fragments without the need for an explosive warhead. These kinetic strikes are effective, but they are also messy. Each successful hit creates an expanding cloud of high-speed debris that remains in orbit for decades, threatening every other satellite in that altitude, regardless of who owns them. To bypass the risk of creating permanent debris fields, military strategy has shifted toward non-kinetic methods that neutralize a satellite's function while leaving its physical frame intact. This high-energy laser facility is built to generate coherent light beams with enough power to reach into low Earth orbit. Rather than destroying the hull, it targets the most sensitive part of the asset, its optics. This display shows the predictable nature of reconnaissance. Ground stations can calculate exactly when an enemy asset will pass directly over the facility. Unlike a missile, a directed energy beam travels at the speed of light. The intercept is instantaneous. This is the dazzle effect. The focused energy is so intense that it permanently melts the delicate lens coatings and imaging sensors inside the satellite, rendering its cameras useless, while the rest of the spacecraft continues to orbit, unharmed. Blinding a satellite achieves the same strategic goal as a missile strike. The adversary can no longer see the battlefield. But because the satellite remains in one piece, there is no debris, and often no immediate proof that an attack even occurred. Space-to-space warfare takes place entirely within the vacuum, moving away from ground-based launches toward a more subtle form of engagement. The most difficult tactic to detect is the co-orbital creep, exemplified by Russia's Matryoshka program, a system designed to hide an offensive capability inside a harmless-looking shell. As this diagram illustrates, a seemingly commercial heavy-lift satellite maneuvers until its orbit matches a target GPS node. By syncing their speeds perfectly, the two objects appear to be a single, non-threatening point on ground-based radar. Once in position, the outer shell separates. It reveals a hidden hunter satellite, shielded from detection during the entire launch and approach phase. The nesting doll effect continues. The hunter satellite then ejects a third, much smaller microsatellite. This killer craft is highly maneuverable and small enough to evade most automated proximity sensors. This microsatellite uses small mechanical arms to physically sever antennas or wires. It can also deploy a localized charge to disable the target's electronics without causing a large explosion. In orbit, proximity is a weapon. By the time a ground controller notices a mechanical failure, the attacker has already drifted away, leaving the malfunction to look like a random hardware glitch. The ultimate technological shift in space control is the deployment of directed energy weapons directly into orbit, removing the interference of the Earth's atmosphere entirely. Space-based chemical lasers provide a surgical strike capability. These are not weapons of mass destruction, but tools of extreme precision. This thermal overlay shows the laser's effect. By focusing a beam on a specific component, like a maneuvering fuel line, the weapon can burn through the metal in seconds. Once the fuel line is severed, the satellite loses its ability to maintain its orbit or change its orientation. It becomes a drifting, useless hulk, neutralized with absolute accuracy and zero physical debris. While lasers target individuals, high-power microwave weapons are designed to deny access to entire regions of space simultaneously. A ground-based 20-gigawatt microwave array requires a massive footprint. This scale of power is necessary to project a concentrated electrogram shows the wave's reach. As the invisible pulse washes over a cluster of satellites, it induces massive electrical currents in every conductive surface it touches. Inside the satellites, delicate processors and memory units violently overload. The sudden surge of energy melts internal circuitry and permanently destroys the satellite's brain in a fraction of a second. The result is the total loss of an entire constellation. The hulls remain intact, but the network itself, the data links and the positioning signals, simply vanishes. When these orbital nodes go dark, the high-speed data and precise navigation that define modern military power are severed. In the strategic void, a nation's global reach can be restricted to the physical horizon by a single invisible pulse, leaving its most advanced forces disconnected and blind.
In the spring of 1915, a heavy, yellow-green fog began bleeding across the fields of Ypres. It didn't arrive with the scream of a shell. It simply rolled over the lip of the trenches, a heavy, silent vapor clinging to the mud. Chlorine gas reacts with the moisture in the human lung to create hydrochloric acid. For the unprepared soldiers caught in the cloud, the sensation was a literal drowning from the inside out. Survival depended on primitive evasion. Men soaked rags in water, or their own urine, and strapped them over their faces with goggles, attempting to filter the air before it reached their lungs. But the early masters of chemical warfare faced a strategic paradox. By releasing a weapon into the atmosphere, they surrendered it to the weather. A shifting wind could push a lethal cloud back into the faces of the very men who launched it. These agents proved that a single deployment could inflict thousands of casualties. They also introduced a permanent variable of chaos, a weapon that terrorized the field but could not be steered. To bypass the unpredictability of chemicals, military science looked toward living organisms. By the mid-20th century, researchers began isolating naturally occurring pathogens like anthrax and the plague for direct weaponization. During the Cold War, the focus shifted to industrial volume. Massive covert facilities were constructed to cultivate these agents on a factory scale, ensuring a stockpile of biological threats to match the nuclear arsenals. These stockpiles were built for mass effect. A single gram of weapons-grade anthrax contains enough spores to infect millions, with no mechanism to distinguish between a combatant and a civilian. The architects of these weapons worked in total physical isolation. They operated in pressurized suits and sealed chambers, perpetually connected to external air supplies to avoid the very plagues they were perfecting. Despite global efforts to ban these programs, the underlying risk remained constant. Any large-scale release threatened a chain of contagion that could not be contained by any border. Modern technology has moved beyond the discovery of natural diseases. We now have the tools to rewrite the internal code of a pathogen, shaping its behavior at the genetic level. This introduces the theory of the genomic weapon. Imagine a synthetic virus drifting through a population, searching for a specific genetic sequence. The pathogen remains dormant until it detects a predetermined DNA marker. It acts as a biological lock and key.
activating only when it identifies its intended target. Biosecurity intelligence now focuses on digital footprints. Hostile sequences can be stored as code within global genetic databases, hidden as strings of data until they are synthesized. If the theory of genomic targeting holds, it offers a solution to the century-old problem of blowback. A hostile actor could deploy an invisible agent with the surgical precision of a targeted strike. A century ago, the terror of chemical warfare was visual. You could stand in a trench and watch the air itself turn into a threat. Genomic targeting moves that boundary inside the cell. It proposes a future where our own genetic markers, the very code of our identity, serve as the triggers for our destruction. The target is no longer the soldier in the trench, but the civilian in the city. Populations are vulnerable to an agent that leaves infrastructure standing while selecting victims with microscopic accuracy. There is no alarm and no visible cloud. The weapon is engineered to wait within the body, silent and undetectable, until it finds the match it was built to kill. The quest to master the architecture of invisible death has come full circle. We have not gained control over the weapon. We have simply written the threat into the code of life itself. In the final years of World War II, a sprawling, highly classified race played out in the high desert laboratory of Los Alamos. Driven by the fear that Axis scientists would crack the physics first, the Manhattan Project gathered the world's brightest minds to harness atomic energy in total secrecy. The theoretical math quickly gave way to a terrifying reality. By splitting a heavy nucleus, scientists found they could initiate a rapid, uncontrollable fission chain reaction, releasing millions of times more energy than conventional explosives. In August 1945, that theoretical physics was weaponized over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The towering radioactive plumes confirmed that humanity had successfully engineered the absolute weapon. The devastation on the ground was absolute. Entire city grids, centuries of built infrastructure, and tens of thousands of lives were completely erased in a fraction of a second, leaving only scorched plains in their wake. Beyond the immediate military victory, the project successfully harnessed the same forces that power the stars. For the first time, scientists and leaders possessed the direct mechanism for human extinction, a reality they had to reconcile with immediately. And the knowledge could never be uninvented. Humanity was trapped in a paradox. From that point forward, international survival would depend entirely on the persistent, looming threat of global annihilation. This chart illustrates the rapid technological escalation. Early fission bombs were measured in kilotons, thousands of tons of TNT. But within a decade, the US and Soviets developed thermonuclear fusion devices measured in megatons, yields exponentially more destructive than what was dropped on Japan. Looking at this map, you can see the architecture required to deliver these new yields. It's called the nuclear triad, a globe-spanning delivery system designed to ensure a nation could launch a strike from anywhere on Earth at a moment's notice. The air leg relied on long-range strategic bombers. These aircraft could be placed on continuous airborne alert, providing a highly visible deterrent and the crucial ability to recall a strike right up until the final moments. Meanwhile, the land-based leg utilized heavily fortified underground silos housing intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. These offered immediate, high-yield retaliation that could cross the planet in under 30 minutes. The triad ensured that no preemptive strike could ever fully eliminate a nation's ability to retaliate. By distributing the arsenal across air, land, and sea, the superpowers locked themselves in a permanent, inescapable standoff. This flowchart maps out the grim logic that supposedly kept the peace: mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It is the simple guarantee that any attack initiates an inevitable sequence, ending in the total destruction of both the attacker and the defender. Within that framework, targeting doctrines split. The counterforce strategy prioritized striking enemy military assets and silos to degrade their ability to retaliate. Conversely, the counter-value strategy targeted population centers, relying on the sheer punitive horror of civilian casualties to stop an attack from ever happening. Pushing these doctrines to the edge brought the world to the brink of disaster, most notably during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, where the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba nearly turned a geopolitical dispute into a planetary execution. The burden of this game theory fell directly on the crews staffing the command centers. Maintaining hair-trigger readiness meant living with launch-on-warning protocols. When radar glitches and false alarms inevitably occurred, those isolated personnel had just minutes to decide if civilization was about to end. And still, the arsenal expanded. The invention of MIRVs, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, allowed a single missile to splinter into a swarm of warheads falling from space. Intercepting a barrage of that scale was a physical impossibility. The Cold War's perceived stability relied on a high-risk gamble. A single radar glitch or a misunderstood military exercise could have initiated a launch sequence before either side realized it was a mistake. With the dissolution of the INF Treaty and the abandonment of the Open Skies Agreement, the structural guardrails that managed the Cold War have eroded. This vacuum and the entry of new nuclear powers has transformed the global balance into a complex, multipolar landscape. To gain an edge, nations are engineering next-generation delivery systems specifically designed to bypass the early warning radar networks built in the 20th century. Hypersonic glide vehicles operate in this space. They travel at extreme Mach speeds, but unlike traditional ICBMs on a predictable ballistic arc, they can maneuver rapidly through the upper atmosphere, slipping past modern defense grids before a response can be organized. The threat extends deep underwater as well. Russia has developed the Poseidon, an autonomous, nuclear-armed submarine drone. It is engineered to cross entire oceans undetected and detonate just off a coastline, burying major naval bases and cities beneath a highly radioactive tsunami. In the air, the Burevestnik is an experimental Russian cruise missile powered by a miniaturized nuclear reactor. With a limitless power source, it can theoretically stay airborne indefinitely, flying circuitous, unpredictable routes around the globe to strike from completely undefended angles. By stripping away the flight time and predictability that once allowed for stable deterrence, these systems remove the psychological buffer that previously prevented a launch. They create an environment where an attack can reach its target before a defender even realizes they are under threat. The escalation ladder remains in place, but it is now built on a taller cliff. Today, global survival remains entirely dependent on the fragile, high-stakes psychology of deterrence, a balance that cannot afford a single error.
Economic warfare strikes at a nation's capacity to survive by severing its access to resources and trade. It is a siege conducted through commerce, designed to dismantle an adversary's stability without a single kinetic strike. Athenian decrees and Roman grain embargoes demonstrate how ancient the mechanics of trade weaponization truly are. In 432 BC, Athens banned a rival city-state from its harbors and markets, using its maritime dominance to force a political submission. These early physical blockades relied on a direct pressure point: starvation. By surrounding a city and sealing its trade routes, attacking armies leveraged the hunger of civilian populations to trigger panic and force a regime to collapse from within. By the early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte attempted to choke the British economy through the continental system. He ordered European ports to reject all British goods, marking the first attempt at a coordinated, continent-wide trade blockade. As civilizations grew increasingly reliant on complex, interconnected trade networks for their survival, their vulnerability to economic starvation expanded. During the First and Second World Wars, resource denial required immense physical force. Massive naval armadas patrolled global shipping lanes, enforcing total embargoes to bleed opposing empires of the oil, steel, and rubber needed to maintain their war machines. In the aftermath of 1945, the theater of conflict shifted to the boardroom. The Bretton Woods system tied global economies to a standardized framework of international banking and exchange. The men and women managing national wealth gained the leverage of military generals. National treasuries and central banks replaced concrete bunkers as the primary command centers of global dominance. Unified banking coalitions and shared currencies created tightly bound bureaucratic machines. An alliance of financial institutions now possessed the administrative power to dictate which nations could participate in global commerce. The state that controls the financial architecture and issues the dominant reserve currency holds the ultimate leverage.
They possess a switch that can instantly paralyze an adversary's economy from a desk thousands of miles away. A comprehensive sanction is designed to isolate an entire nation. By sealing borders off from broad global trade, the targeted economy is trapped in amber. You can see the result in the streets. Vintage vehicles and aging infrastructure stand as physical evidence of a country frozen out of technological progress for decades. Modern statecraft favors precision. Governments increasingly deploy targeted sanctions, surgically freezing the offshore assets of specific ruling elites, military contractors, and state-owned enterprises to maximize pressure on leadership, while aiming to minimize civilian crossfire. The most aggressive tactic is digital isolation. SWIFT is the messaging backbone that allows thousands of international banks to securely transfer capital. Severing a nation's access to this network instantly blinds its banks, preventing them from moving money across borders. This isolation acts as a contagion through secondary sanctions. If a neutral third-party country attempts to do business with the primary target, they risk being cut off from the network themselves. It forces foreign governments and multinational corporations to choose a side. When hundreds of billions in foreign sovereign reserves are frozen without warning, the sudden loss of capital sends shockwaves through global financial markets. While a naval blockade takes weeks to mobilize, digital sanctions operate instantly. A national economy can be dismantled in the time it takes to transmit a single message. This pressure is routinely deployed against heavily defended states to achieve security outcomes. To stall Iran's nuclear ambitions, international coalitions restricted their oil exports and choked their banking sector, forcing diplomatic negotiations without a kinetic strike. Against massive adversaries, the scale of economic warfare expands. In response to Russian military aggression in 2014 and specifically in 2022, Allied nations executed rapid energy decoupling and froze roughly half of Moscow's sovereign wealth reserves overnight. The theoretical pressure mapped out in a central bank translates immediately to the streets. Supply chains for basic consumer goods evaporate, inflation spikes, and foreign corporations abandon their infrastructure, leaving commercial sectors hollowed out. Beyond targeting existing wealth, governments weaponize the supply chains of the future. Export controls are deployed to strictly ban the sale of dual-use technologies, commercial equipment, and software that can be adapted for military capabilities. This restricts access to the base layer of modern industry. Controlling the flow of advanced semiconductors and the rare earth minerals required to build them is a calculated move to preemptively stop a rival's ability to develop artificial intelligence and next-generation weapons. Controlling the specialized microchips and natural gas pipelines that power a rival state is the strategic equivalent of controlling the grain ships of antiquity. Policies drafted in sterile boardrooms translate directly into the collapse of life savings. When a national currency is devalued under external pressure, millions of ordinary citizens are pushed into hyperinflation by strategies designed to squeeze their leaders. Targeted states adapt. To keep their economies breathing, heavily sanctioned nations build resilient shadow economies. They deploy fleets of unmarked ships to smuggle oil and basic commodities under the cover of darkness. They accelerate the development of digital countermeasures, using cryptocurrency to generate capital and building alternative payment systems to bypass the US dollar entirely. This exposes a massive geopolitical risk. The persistent use of economic weapons forces isolated nations to look toward one another. By locking them out of Western financial systems, it incentivizes targeted states to forge new, insulated alliances out of sheer survival. The relentless escalation of the invisible siege is fracturing a once unified global economy into hostile, multipolar blocks. The defining wars of the future are being scripted in the ledgers of global trade.
The architecture of the human brain relies entirely on incoming signals to construct its internal model of reality. If an adversary can intercept those signals, they can write the reality. Ancient military strategists recognized this vulnerability early on. They understood that carefully applied deception, rather than brute force, was the most efficient route to victory. By the early 20th century, industrialized nations mechanized these philosophies. State-run printing presses, cinema reels, and radio towers blanketed entire populations in carefully engineered, mass-produced narratives. The objective was clear:
dictate the flow of information, and you break the adversary's will to fight before a single physical weapon is deployed. During the Cold War, Soviet intelligence formalized this psychological doctrine into what they designated as active measures, the systematic use of forgeries, front organizations, and fabricated intelligence to steer foreign political events. In the 1980s, operatives executed Operation Infection. They planted a fabricated letter in an Indian newspaper claiming the United States military engineered the AIDS virus. Through a slow, deliberate process of international citation and repetition, the story successfully took root globally. Yet these analog campaigns suffered from physical limitations. They required human assets on the ground, heavy funding, and years of patient legwork. Geographic and temporal bottlenecks prevented total global scaling. Intelligence agencies possessed the psychological blueprints decades ago. They were simply waiting for an instantaneous, frictionless delivery mechanism to fully weaponize them. Following the turn of the millennium, global populations voluntarily interconnected their daily lives. Social platforms, optimized purely to maximize user engagement, inadvertently constructed the infrastructure required for mass-scale psychological operations. This vector visualization illustrates the mechanics of cognitive warfare. A single emotionally charged piece of media is injected into a network, where recommendation algorithms automatically amplify it to capture human attention. By scraping user data, operatives map psychological profiles and identify exact cultural fault lines. As shown here, target audiences are isolated into deeply polarized clusters based on algorithmic exposure. In modern election meddling, this data allows foreign actors to feed specific demographics custom-tailored disinformation designed to suppress voter turnout or inflame domestic tensions. The 2016 UK Brexit referendum served as a major testing ground. Massive troves of scraped behavioral data were weaponized to target undecided voters with precision-guided influence campaigns. When the scope of data harvesting by firms like Cambridge Analytica was revealed, tech executives were forced into public tribunals to explain how foreign entities had so easily turned their platforms against the electorate. Operatives quickly refined their tactics. They deployed automated bot networks to take fabricated stories from anonymous fringe forums and artificially boost them until mainstream media networks were pressured to cover them, a process known as narrative laundering. Adversaries now treat elections as unprotected data environments, using narrative engineering to probe for and exploit systemic vulnerabilities. Today, multiple state actors operate industrial-scale troll farms, working in constant shifts to sustain permanent information campaigns across every major platform. China's United Front Work Department utilizes diplomatic leverage and institutional pressure to aggressively silence critics and reshape the global narrative in Beijing's favor. This threshold chart illustrates what strategists term gray zone operations. These are hostile actions deliberately calibrated to stay just below the rigid line of armed conflict, maintaining plausible deniability. Notice how these external attacks are masked. State actors fund domestic proxies, local influencers, and useful idiots, successfully laundering the foreign operation as organic domestic outrage. This psychological pressure is frequently paired with the strategic hacking and leaking of private institutional communications. The goal is to paralyze public trust in the target's internal systems. The ultimate strategic prize is reflexive control. By feeding an adversary meticulously tailored synthetic information, you force them into voluntarily making the exact decisions that lead to their own destruction. Social platforms now serve as active, permanent theaters of reflexive control. Adversaries do not need to invade societies if they can compel those societies to tear themselves apart from the inside. We are now crossing into an era of deepfakes and AI-generated synthetic media, establishing a frontier of deception that is nearly undetectable. Automated generation removes the final bottleneck of human labor. Millions of fabricated audio clips, images, and videos can be deployed simultaneously, dropping the barrier to entry for psychological manipulation to zero. This triggers a crisis of cognitive security. The human brain lacks the biological mechanisms necessary to distinguish an organic human interaction from a hyper-realistic synthetic forgery. modern information warfare floods the zone with contradictory noise, aiming for the total collapse of objective truth. Without a shared baseline of facts, collective action becomes impossible. When every source of information is viewed with suspicion, the friction of constant internal debate halts policymaking and erodes the legitimacy of public institutions. Physical borders and kinetic military defenses offer zero protection when the assault is seamlessly woven into a population's daily digital consumption. The modern battle space resides within the mind of every individual holding a screen. In this conflict, the first and most vital defense is recognizing that the target is you.
When we look at history, we tend to fixate on the noise, the clash of steel, artillery barrages, lines drawn on blood-soaked maps. But the physical battlefield is often just a symptom. The real war, the one that actually decides who survives and who falls, is fought in absolute silence, long before the first shot is ever fired. Look back to the earliest empires. Egyptian pharaohs deployed intricate networks of scouts across the desert to track shifting alliances. Roman cipher clerks protected supply routes with primitive cryptography. They understood that sovereignty wasn't secured by legions alone, but by knowing exactly what their rivals were planning in the dark. Over 2 millennia ago, Sun Tzu defined this necessity as foreknowledge. Operating blind against an enemy is a guaranteed death sentence. If you can pierce the fog of war with asymmetric information, you instantly neutralize your opponent's physical advantage. You strike where they are weak and vanish when they are strong. For centuries, this tradecraft relied on scattered spies and royal court informants. But by the 19th century, industrialized warfare required something far more systematic. Militaries across Europe built dedicated intelligence bureaus, turning the ancient art of espionage into a professional, bureaucratic machine. Acquiring secrets is no longer a byproduct of conflict. It is the absolute prerequisite for a nation to exist at all. The foundation of this machine is collection, and it begins with human intelligence. The mechanics rely on exploiting human psychology. Whether it was the medieval Council of Ten running spy rings across the Venetian Republic, or modern intelligence officers carefully cultivating foreign moles, the dynamic relies on trust, leverage, and the heavy psychological toll placed on the asset. But humans are fallible. They lie, and they misremember. World War I forced a leap into technical collection. Militaries mounted bulky cameras onto the sides of canvas biplanes, flying above trench lines to photograph enemy positions. These flights produced the first objective, high-altitude records of the front lines. While cameras captured the ground, another frontier opened in the airwaves: signals intelligence, or SIGINT. Intercepting the raw, invisible communications of your enemy provides a direct feed into their strategic mindset, provided they don't know you're listening. This image shows the keyboard and dense plugboard wiring of a German Enigma machine used in World War II. Designed to prevent interception, it was a cryptological fortress, capable of generating nearly 159 quintillion unique settings to scramble military orders. Defeating that fortress didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in the claustrophobic, cluttered offices of Bletchley Park. By breaking the Enigma cipher, Allied codebreakers tracked U-boat wolf packs and anticipated Axis offensives, actively redrawing the map of the war. Yet, the moment you successfully collect an enemy's truth, you expose yourself to a new danger, because if they figure out how you're watching, they will feed you a lie. By the time the Cold War froze borders across Europe, the intelligence landscape had descended into severe, absolute paranoia. At bottlenecks like Checkpoint Charlie in divided Berlin, opposing factions operated in close physical proximity. The environment demanded intense compartmentalization and constant counter-surveillance. Nations realized they had to weaponize their own vulnerabilities. This is strategic deception. In Soviet doctrine, it is known as maskirovka, the deliberate projection of false narratives, deploying dummy equipment and bogus radio traffic, designed to completely obscure a military's true intentions. The Allies executed a masterclass in this during Operation Fortitude.
To protect the D-Day landings, they constructed phantom armies out of wood and rubber. This inflatable decoy tank sat in an empty field, a physical lie meant to trick German reconnaissance planes. But physical lies are easy to dismantle compared to the terror of human betrayal. Counterintelligence exists to hunt down the threats operating inside your own walls. When a single mole compromises an agency, the resulting paranoia can paralyze an entire intelligence apparatus for years. Few betrayals illustrate this, like the Cambridge Five. Men like Donald Maclean, deeply embedded in the British establishment, were ideologically aligned with the Soviet Union. As a highly placed diplomat, Maclean passed thousands of classified documents to Moscow, proving that top-tier security clearances offer zero protection against ideological defection. In this labyrinth, finding the enemy's secret is only half the battle. Protecting your own carefully constructed lies is what keeps you alive. All of this effort, the spies, the wiretaps, the overhead imagery, generates millions of data points. But raw data is useless on its own. It has to enter the analysis and fusion phase. This is where human analysts sift through terabytes of noise to connect disparate fragments and extract actual strategic insight. This map shows intelligence fusion during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Analysts combined U-2 photography and human intelligence to map a covert Soviet buildup. These black icons mark ballistic missile sites. Fusing this data allowed President Kennedy to quarantine the island before they became operational. Today, that fusion process happens at light speed. The battlefield has migrated from chalk marks and physical dead drops to OSINT, open-source intelligence scraped from public servers, paired with real-time satellite telemetry and artificial intelligence capable of predicting enemy movements before they happen. And the nature of the weapons has shifted. With operations like Stuxnet, a malicious computer worm that physically destroyed Iranian nuclear centrifuges, cyber-espionage proved that digital infiltration can now trigger kinetic, destructive consequences. Fused intelligence now functions as a primary offensive weapon. During the bin Laden raid, years of data collection culminated in a single tactical operation, allowing national leaders to watch a decapitation strike unfold live, guided entirely by an invisible web of data. The civilian world draws a heavy line between peacetime and wartime, but in the domain of intelligence, that distinction is a myth. The shadow war never stops. When the intelligence cycle fails, the results are catastrophic. Sudden surprise attacks, like the devastation of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, expose the horrifying cost of systemic blindness. A failure in foreknowledge is paid for in blood. The operatives who fight in this domain carry a profound psychological burden. They manipulate the course of global history from the dark, fully aware that their catastrophic failures will be broadcast to the world, while their greatest victories must remain classified forever. We have evolved from desert scouts and wax seals to quantum cryptography and predictive algorithms. The medium of tradecraft updates with every generation, but the desperate, existential need to know what lies hidden in the dark remains exactly the same. True sovereignty doesn't belong to the nation that can muster the largest army. It belongs to the nation that masters the shadows. An ambush strips away every advantage of a conventional military in seconds. When a quiet tree line violently erupts, heavy armor, long-range artillery, and rigid command structures suddenly mean very little. A force with a fraction of the budget and equipment dictates the terms of survival. The Spanish literally named it the Little War, guerrilla. During Napoleon's occupation of the Iberian Peninsula, local fighters refused to meet the French army in open fields. They struck supply lines, harassed isolated patrols, and vanished. Look at these fighters from the Boer War. There are no standardized uniforms, no elaborate fortifications. They fight from shallow, hand-dug dirt trenches. The Boers utilized their exact knowledge of the South African landscape, bleeding British columns and dissolving into the brush before return fire could be coordinated. By the Irish War of Independence, tactics moved directly into the streets. See the rigid formations and high-visibility uniforms of state soldiers. They stand out. The Irish Republican Army turned this visibility into a liability, relying on targeted assassinations and rapid disappearances. A fighter was indistinguishable from a baker or mechanic until the moment a trigger was pulled. When a defending force weaponizes geography and refuses to offer a fixed target, a massive deficit in firepower becomes irrelevant. Decades later, chaotic survival tactics became a precise methodology. Mao Zedong documented his strategies in China, turning hit-and-run operations into a rigid military doctrine. This diagram maps Mao's codified phases of insurgency. A campaign does not start with gunfire. The wide base is pure political organization and recruitment. Only when the foundation is set does it move to the middle tier, active guerrilla combat and sabotage. Finally, at the peak, the weakened adversary is met with conventional mobile warfare. Mao argued that the guerrilla must move amongst the people as a fish swims in the sea. Without the water, the logistical cover, the food, the silence of the local population, the fish dies. The insurgency requires a sympathetic or coerced public to act as camouflage. The Viet Cong executed this doctrine with lethal precision. As you can see in this image, fighters physically embedded themselves into the earth. They constructed vast, hidden base areas and subterranean networks, denying American and South Vietnamese forces any visible enemy infrastructure to bomb. Victory was redefined as a permanent bleeding tax on the enemy's resources, calculated to exhaust their political will over years or decades. Following the Second World War, ideologically driven conflicts erupted across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Notice the extreme variance in age among the fighters pictured here. Armed children stand beside hardened adults, a deliberate multi-generational integration into the community. To maintain this grip, shadow groups construct parallel governance. They step into voids left by weak states, operating their own localized court systems, collecting their own taxes, and running independent medical clinics. They act as the state in everything but name, but services are coupled with severe coercion. Shadow governance relies heavily on dual-track psychological operations. Insurgents distribute localized propaganda while simultaneously executing highly public terror tactics against informants or defectors, ensuring the silence of the village. The execution of this control depends entirely on the environment. A rural insurgency survives by navigating vast, unforgiving mountain ranges or dense foliage, physically isolating themselves. An urban insurgency operates inches away from state security forces, surviving purely on the anonymity of crowds and tightly compartmentalized intelligence networks. By establishing social and economic authority over the local citizens, the insurgent renders the state's military control over the physical roads and buildings meaningless. Localized resistance frequently attracts the attention of global powers. Look closely at the Afghan Mujahideen fighters in this photograph. They are wielding heavy, factory-manufactured anti-armor weaponry. This equipment did not originate in the Afghan mountains. It exposes the presence of an external state sponsor. State intelligence agencies funnel untraceable cash and establish covert arms pipelines, using local fighters to achieve geopolitical goals without ever officially declaring war. Look at the crude construction of this improvised explosive device, a cheap plastic jug packed with explosives, wired to a rudimentary trigger mechanism. On the ground, these cheap devices tear the tracks off multi-million-dollar vehicles and inflict severe psychological trauma on patrolling infantry. To escape the lethal precision of overhead airstrikes, fighters are forced below ground. Observe the suffocating confines of this hand-dug tunnel. Entire logistical chains, ammunition depots, hospitals, and command centers are buried deep in the earth, built to evade thermal cameras and leadership decapitation strikes. Moving supplies requires absolute secrecy. Logistics networks operate exclusively in the dead of night, using civilian transport and shifting routes to outrun aerial surveillance. The fusion of decentralized guerrilla tactics and unlimited state funding creates a scenario where conventional force achieves no lasting impact. In the 21st century, the battlefields of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria forced historical guerrilla doctrines to collide with massive urban density. Notice the heavy armor of this modern patrol. They are completely visible, navigating narrow, debris-filled streets surrounded by hundreds of blind spots. The complex concrete architecture of modern cities absorbs explosions and disrupts satellite imagery. As seen in the charred wreckage of this tank, Advanced technological supremacy is easily neutralized in close quarters. Massive armies are dragged into grueling block-by-block attrition. Today, irregular warfare runs on commercial, off-the-shelf technology. Microcells organize protests and recruit fighters using decentralized social media platforms while coordinating precise strikes over heavily encrypted mobile messaging apps. The air domain has been entirely democratized. Look closely at the underside of this commercially available quadcopter. Insurgents modify these cheap drones in basic workshops, turning civilian hobby tech into highly accurate improvised aerial bombers. Access to commercial technology allows a scattered network of a few dozen fighters to inflict the infrastructural damage and command the media attention of a full mechanized battalion. Currently, major geopolitical powers actively seek the shadows. Direct conventional warfare carries massive economic and nuclear risks. Instead, nations fund proxy groups and paramilitary networks, launching strikes while relying entirely on the cover of plausible deniability. This map illustrates the immediate trajectory of global conflict. Future operations will be executed by highly fractured proxy networks. They will draw funding from untraceable cryptocurrency channels and deploy localized cyber attacks against civilian infrastructure, striking from the dark and dissolving instantly. Asymmetric warfare functions as a resilient, permanent evolutionary trait of human conflict. As long as immense imbalances of wealth and military power exist between states and populations, the shadow front will adapt. It remains the ultimate, unkillable science of the underdog. Beneath the vibrant streets of Havana, a new domain of warfare was quietly activated. The initial targets were diplomats, living in what they believed were secure, unremarkable neighborhoods. In the quiet of a private apartment, the attack begins without warning. The air itself seems to thicken. The target feels an intense, crushing pressure inside their skull, accompanied by a piercing directional sound that doesn't exist in the physical room, bringing on immediate and severe vertigo. The physiological response is instant. Motor functions fail. The ability to concentrate or stand upright collapses as the inner ear and cognitive centers are overwhelmed by the invisible pulse. When investigators arrive hours later, they find a pristine environment. There is no shattered glass, no chemical residue left on surfaces, and no digital breach in the communication networks. Traditional artillery requires mass and leaves behind craters, shrapnel, and distinct chemical markers. A directed energy strike leaves an absolute forensic vacuum. This lack of physical evidence completely compromises the concept of a secure facility. Embassies are built to withstand kinetic assaults on fortified sovereign soil, but that armor is useless against an invisible spectrum. The reality of the Havana incidents is the weaponization of the environment. A secure living room is turned into a hostile zone, allowing operatives to strike and walk away without leaving a single verifiable trace. This tactic has a deeply documented lineage, tracing back to the deep freeze of the Cold War in Soviet Moscow. For over 2 decades, the United States Embassy in the Russian capital was bathed in a continuous, low-level barrage of microwave radiation. Intelligence agencies classified the phenomenon as the Moscow signal. The initial intent was not physical harm. Soviet operatives used the directed microwaves to power dormant, batteryless listening devices hidden deep within the embassy's walls, allowing them to intercept secure keystrokes and communications passively. Uncovering this invisible bombardment triggered quiet, high-stakes diplomatic protests at the United Nations. Officials were forced to navigate a confrontation over an attack they could measure but could not physically show the public. By the 1970s, the hardware necessary for this type of electronic infiltration was already highly advanced, successfully miniaturized and packed into covert, everyday briefcases by adversary intelligence services. Over the next 50 years, engineers advanced the capabilities of these arrays. They pushed for higher frequencies, condensing scattered radiation into tightly focused, highly directional pulses. The modern invisible strike is the natural evolution of that mature, decades-old surveillance program, optimized from a tool of espionage into an instrument of physical assault. Executing a modern strike requires highly specific logistics. An operative must establish a direct line of sight to the target's physical location, often setting up in an adjacent hotel room or parked vehicle. The hardware fires a concentrated beam of pulsed microwave energy, passing through solid concrete without degrading. Upon striking the skull, the nervous system absorbs the incoming wave. This causes brain tissues to rapidly expand and contract, which the brain misinterprets as a loud, piercing sound. This specific physics loophole is incredibly effective. The beam completely ignores the physical armor of the building and interacts directly with the internal biological wiring of the target. However, there is a logistical bottleneck. Propelling that concentrated energy over a distance requires massive power generation. An operative likely relies on heavy industrial battery arrays and large directional antennas, necessitating the use of commercial vans or modified cargo trucks to conceal the hardware. The attackers leverage the laws of acoustics and electromagnetic physics to deliver an unblockable assault directly into the skull of the victim. The aftermath of the beam is devastating. Months and years after the initial pulse, targeted diplomats and intelligence officers present with documented traumatic brain injury, sustained cognitive decline, and chronic motor impairment. The physical damage to the victim's brain is permanent, while the operative powers down the transmitter and drives away, dissolving back into the local population. This creates absolute geopolitical paralysis. Institutions like the Department of State are tasked with formulating a response to an attack they cannot forensically prove ever happened. It is an execution of gray zone warfare. The strikes are carefully calibrated to neutralize specific, high-value intelligence personnel while remaining safely below the threshold of conventional military retaliation. By utilizing a weapon that produces no blast radius, no chemical marker, and intercepts no data, a hostile state guarantees total plausible deniability. Havana syndrome effectively demonstrated the viability of a new tactic. The most effective weapons in modern espionage no longer break walls or shatter glass. They treat the human body as an entirely unprotected, invisible battlefield. Modern multi-domain operations rely on a specific connective tissue of radio frequencies, GPS signals, and digital encryption. Under current conditions, electronic warfare units can now actively locate, jam, and sever these classical networks in real time. Quantum information science introduces new physical constraints that negate the core assumptions of current defensive systems. This shift moves the strategic battle space away from the domination of continuous waves in the electromagnetic spectrum. Instead, it focuses on the manipulation of discrete subatomic particles existing in multiple overlapping states. This estimate evaluates the specific vulnerabilities now facing the three pillars of modern military power: GPS-based precision, low observable stealth, and public key cryptography. The following analysis is divided into three functional domains: sensing and metrology, communications, and computing. Achieving a strategic advantage in this environment requires a doctrine based on the manipulation of quantum states rather than classical electromagnetic signals. In a contested battle space, external signals are often jammed or spoofed. In these conditions, a platform's ability to navigate is tied to the reliability of its external data links. Here is alternative PNT. Left, an open-loop GPS receiver intercepted by jamming. Right, a closed-loop quantum gravimeter operates internally. It measures local gravity variations, matching readings to internal maps for driftless navigation, remaining completely unaffected by jamming or satellite loss. This sensitivity to physical mass and gravity also allows for a new approach to stealth detection, particularly in subsurface naval operations. This topographical view shows the Earth's constant magnetic field lines. To track targets across the seafloor, navies use superconducting quantum interference devices, or SQUIDs. Moving a massive metal submarine hull through water warps local magnetic field lines. SQUIDs detect these specific distortions. Acoustic silencing only traps sound waves. It cannot mask the physical magnetic interaction between the vessel and the Earth, rendering traditional stealth ineffective here. Similar principles apply to airborne stealth when evaluating the feasibility of quantum radar and LiDAR. Classical stealth uses specialized paint and angles to deflect or absorb radio waves. Quantum radar uses entangled photons. If a photon strikes a target, its entangled partner instantly registers the contact, completely bypassing radar-absorbent coatings or geometric deflection. In this domain, physical presence in space guarantees detection. If a platform exists, it interacts with quantum fields, allowing it to be targeted without regard for classical cloaking. Command and control networks currently rely on mathematical complexity for security. This means a network is only secure as long as an adversary lacks the processing power to solve the underlying math. Quantum key distribution, or QKD, moves away from math-based security toward a system grounded in the physical laws of nature. Here, a photon stream encodes a cryptographic key. Under the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, observing a quantum state changes it. If an adversary attempts interception, the act of observation forces the photons out of their original state, permanently altering the data's geometric shape. This alteration collapses the data and provides an immediate alert to both the sender and receiver, identifying the exact moment of the interception attempt. While secure, scaling this into a global quantum internet requires a significant investment in physical hardware. Because quantum states are fragile, transmitting them over long distances requires space-based entanglement nodes positioned in orbit to relay signals across the globe. On the ground, terrestrial distribution requires specialized fiber optic quantum repeaters placed at specific intervals to maintain the integrity of the signal. This architecture shifts the point of failure. While the data itself is secure from hacking, the hardware required to transmit it is exposed. Orbital satellites and terrestrial repeater nodes remain susceptible to kinetic strikes, anti-satellite weapons, and directed energy attacks. Deploying QKD networks requires a reallocation of resources to defend these physical nodes, as the vulnerability moves from the digital code to the physical infrastructure. Beyond transmission, we must address the processing of data and the threat of quantum cryptanalysis. This server farm represents a strategy known as store now, decrypt later. Adversaries are currently intercepting and archiving encrypted military data, waiting for the hardware necessary to break the encryption. The tool for this retrospective decryption is Shor's algorithm. Shor's algorithm factors massive prime numbers with high efficiency. In a quantum environment, it shatters the RSA and ECC public key infrastructure that protects modern communications. This creates an immediate requirement for defense architectures to transition to post-quantum cryptography standards before quantum hardware is fully realized. Quantum computing also provides significant advantages in theater-level operational support. This visualization shows a quantum algorithm optimizing supply chain routes in real time. As new threats appear, the system processes millions of variables to reroute logistics instantly through contested space. Commanders can use this power to run battlefield simulations that test millions of operational permutations simultaneously, providing a level of foresight not possible with classical computers. In material science, quantum processors simulate molecular structures with high precision. These simulations accelerate the discovery of new energetic materials, advanced armor plates, and metamaterials for next-generation stealth applications. Control of this domain provides a definitive advantage in the allocation of time and resources. Integrated, these three domains form a single kill chain. Quantum sensors locate targets by physical interaction, bypassing traditional cloaking. Targeting data routes through QKD networks, physically securing the link. Simultaneously, computing nodes optimize logistics to sustain the strike. In this environment, the legacy systems that define current superiority, classical stealth, math-based encryption, and external GPS, become liabilities. The shift to a post-quantum battlespace is not a distant concern for future planners. Deployed quantum gravimeters and the ongoing archiving of encrypted data make this an active intelligence reality. Surviving this shift requires an immediate overhaul of procurement and doctrine. The quantum strategic frontier has already been reached.
Throughout history, dominance relied on the physical control of territory. You seized the land, breached the walls, or utilized industrial-scale artillery to level infrastructure from a distance. Eventually, the physical battlefield expanded vertically into the skies. Air power and remote systems allowed for clinical, high-altitude strikes that separated the operator from the immediate consequences of the kill. Today, the arms race has moved inward. The latest theater of war has no geographic terrain. It exists in the sixth domain, human consciousness itself.
The Kremlin's Unit 29155, an elite GRU psychological warfare team, has operationalized this frontier. Their primary tool is a system described in internal files as a quantum phone to the consciousness. This device utilizes quantum entanglement to establish an instantaneous, untraceable link to a target's biological systems. It monitors heart rate, brainwave activity, and emergent thoughts without requiring a single physical wire or local signal. Traditional borders and physical defenses offer no protection against an adversary that operates from inside the target's own mind. Once connected, the GRU begins a campaign of neurological disruption. They inject phantom noises, whispered threats, induced insomnia, and waves of nausea directly into the target's perception. The objective is to identify Russian expatriates with high technical value. If they can't be recruited as clandestine assets through this pressure, the operators escalate the biological assault to drive the target towards psychological collapse. This weapon functions with built-in tactical deniability. Because the symptoms perfectly mimic severe mental illness, medical professionals routinely dismiss the victims. When a target describes hearing voices or feeling remote physical pain, they are categorized as suffering from schizophrenic psychosis. The act of seeking help completes the siege. The institutional diagnosis discredits the target and achieves the GRU's ultimate goal of total social isolation. Case files for Target Zero reveal this process in action. Alexei Ivanov was a successful financial algorithm developer, living a comfortable, assimilated life in San Francisco. The GRU initiated the assault by weaponizing his forgotten heritage. During REM sleep, operators flooded his brain with engineered visions of a Russian childhood, forcing dormant linguistic pathways to reactivate against his will. The permanent quantum connection took a physical toll. Alexei experienced sustained artificial insomnia and biological stress that physicians misidentified as a standard mental breakdown. When Alexei attempted to warn U.S. intelligence agencies, he was met with institutional betrayal. He was placed on an involuntary psychiatric hold by the very system he tried to alert. The GRU playbook was executed. The target was physically brutalized, chemically restrained, and stripped of credibility. But the weak point of this advanced technology is the human operator. Extended operations lead to fatigue, and fatigue leads to errors. This visualization shows a microscopic anomaly Alexei caught. The operator placed phonetic stress on the second syllable of an English word, a rhythmic error consistent with a native Russian speaker. This provided Alexei proof that the torment was an external, state-sponsored attack. Alexei used this discovery to transition from a target into an active combatant. He began cataloging every phoneme and frequency transmitted by the operators. He established a cognitive firewall to separate and categorize injected GRU data from his own thoughts, effectively treating the assault as malware to be isolated. Because the quantum link is bidirectional, Alexei began a counteroffensive. He fed truth viruses back through the connection, injecting facts about the program's failures into the GRU's own operational matrix. Intellectual discipline and hyper-attentive observation neutralized the psychological weapon. A single mind proved more resilient than the technology designed to rewrite it. A protocol error during the connection permanently locked the device to Alexei's frequency. Research suggests that this constant entanglement caused his brain to process information across a dendritic tree of future probability timelines. From this perspective, he identified a critical civilizational fork. He describes a future choice between dead worlds that are ruled by techno-totalitarianism and a united pan-federation focused on the stars. This scientific anomaly is why the program failed to break Target Zero. The GRU's models account for biological stress, but they could not account for a man whose core identity was anchored by faith and an absolute refusal to surrender his autonomy. The invasion of the human mind is not a theoretical threat. It is a global reality that has already begun. The GRU program demonstrates that even technology targeting our internal biology is powerless against a resilient human consciousness that refuses to be rewritten. Look at this pale blue biosphere suspended against the absolute dark. A fragile, isolated ecosystem floating in an immense and potentially hostile void. This thin layer of life is boxed in by compounding crises. Rapid ecological collapse and extreme climate volatility are destabilizing the planet from within. Beyond our atmosphere, we remain a fragmented civilization, making us uniquely vulnerable to the vast unknowns of the cosmos, including the potential for an encounter with an advanced external intelligence we are currently too divided to meet. Faced with these planetary-scale threats, our response has been to look inward. We pour finite, irreplaceable resources into internal conflicts, destroying the exact material wealth and human ingenuity required to keep our species alive. We often justify this self-destruction by pointing to biology. We misread survival of the fittest as an unending zero-sum war, where dominating the neighbor is the absolute rule of nature. But looking into the deep biological history of this planet reveals a different survival mechanism. Cooperation, not warfare, is the ultimate weapon against extinction. Billions of years ago, in the toxic oceans of the early Earth, primitive microbes existed in a state of constant consumption. Single cells aggressively collided, fighting over desperately scarce chemical energy. Eventually, larger predator cells engulfed smaller, rod-shaped bacteria. But instead of digesting them for a quick burst of energy, the host cell stopped the attack. The predator and the prey formed a permanent internal alliance to survive the harsh environment together. Biologists call this process symbiogenesis. This image captures a mitochondrion, the power engine inside almost every living cell today. The distinct folded inner structures, called cristae, map the physical boundary of what was once an independent, free-living organism before it merged with us. Every plant, animal, and human being alive today exists because the foundation of complex life was forged through the transformation of microscopic enemies into a unified, cooperative system. This biological imperative to unite scales up perfectly. When single-celled amoebas exhaust their food supply, they signal each other and fuse their individual bodies together, transforming into a single mobile entity capable of migrating to fertile ground. Further up the evolutionary ladder, we see the emergence of the pack. Wild dogs, wolves, and primates developed complex social networks as a mathematically superior strategy to outlast starvation and fend off apex predators. These survival strategies eventually developed an emotional core. Animals evolved deep, instinctual camaraderie, where an individual will willingly sacrifice its own life to guarantee the survival of the wider group. Humans carry a long, well-documented history of bloodshed. Yet, the dominant advantage that allowed us to populate every continent on Earth was our capacity for immense tribal bonds, sharing knowledge and resources across extended social networks. Over millennia, those early tribal agreements scaled into massive, interconnected civilizations. We built international assemblies to negotiate trade, define laws, and create a system of global diplomacy. Our most enduring historical achievements were rarely built by isolated conquerors dividing the earth. They were constructed by millions of independent minds agreeing to operate as a single, coordinated macroorganism. This brings us back to the precarious position we hold today. If Earth's ecology collapses, the human story terminates immediately. A dead biosphere means we lose the capacity to do anything else. This chart illustrates the biological calculus of our current era. We are pouring a massive, disproportionate volume of the planet's raw materials and capital into internal conflict. Endless border wars are evolutionary dead ends, draining the collective energy needed to secure our survival. We must apply the lessons of the mitochondria and the tribe on a planetary scale, abandoning military gridlock to execute a massive evolutionary pivot. By redirecting our technological capacity away from self-destruction, we can stabilize our ecology and push outward. Expanding into space exploration allows us to actively defend against future extraterrestrial threats, rather than waiting passively in the dark. Uniting the human family to secure the biosphere and face the cosmos is the required evolutionary leap for our species. Imagine a thriving, unified Earth that has outgrown its divisions, operating as a single planetary species capable of navigating the stars. The historical record of life on this planet is absolute. Endless internal warfare guarantees our extinction. The evolutionary math leaves us with a stark choice. Divided, we fall. But united through global planetary cooperation, we multiply our chances of survival 1,000 times over.